Welcome back to the John Fredericks Radio Show. This is Mike Rubino, guest hosting for John Fredericks. We are trucking the truth across Virginia and the nation. I want to welcome our next guest, Matt Mowers. I've known Matt for a long time. Matt, how are you this morning?
Mike, I'm doing great. It's a beautiful day in the Granite State up here.
Excellent. Well, Matt, you are running for Congress against a Pelosi shill. So why don't you tell us how the race is going and how people can get involved?
Sure. Well, the race is going great. So, we launched this campaign in the middle of January. No one could have predicted how the world would change in the past 5 months. But the one thing that's remained consistent is that my opponent, Chris Pappas, has still been one of Nancy Pelosi's number one proxy votes since the moment he got to Congress. It doesn't matter what type of radical leftist idea that they push down to that Congress, Chris Pappas has been there every single step of the way. He votes with Pelosi 100% of the time. He votes with AOC 95% of the time. And that just doesn't represent us, the live free or die state. So we've been really encouraged. We've had a lot of momentum. Kevin McCarthy just endorsed our campaign last week. Corey Lewandowski has endorsed our campaign. The president tweeted about our race on Easter Sunday. So if folks are interested in getting involved or learning more, they can go to www.mattmowers.com. That's MATTMOWERS.com, and we'd love to get them involved.
Well, Matt, let me just sing your praises for a second. You were senior White House advisor at the State Department. You worked with Ambassador Deborah Birx. I knew you from the campaign. You worked with Governor Christie before that. I mean, you are a Trump guy through and through, so I know all of our listeners, should be eager to engage. But Matt, you mentioned it. There's been so many things that, have occurred within this country over the last couple months, whether it be coronavirus or George Floyd. What do you make of, first, the defund police stuff? I mean, where is Congressman Pappas on this notion of defunding the police? I know the Granite State is proud of their police tradition. They're all real, true Americans. So what do you make of that?
Yeah, we're going to ask Chris Pappas, and we're actually going to ask him today where he stands on this, because I just think this is another reckless idea. Look, let's not forget that it was just about 3 weeks ago that Nancy Pelosi had every single Democrat just about in Congress, including Chris Pappas, vote for a bill that would actually fund release of violent criminals early from their terms because of coronavirus. Yet now we have a bunch of the same Democrats saying that they want to defund the police. So they're funding early release of violent criminals, but they're defunding the police. I mean, this is just radical, Mike. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is the type of stuff that, it used to be cartoonish when it was said, and now it's exactly what the Pelosi Congress is doing down in Washington, D.C., and Chris Pappas has been part of that every single step of the way. So we're going to ask him today to stand with us, with our law enforcement officers, and oppose this defund the police movement that's afoot right now. We called Chris Pappas out on Friday, saying that he has not condemned the rioters because he hasn't. Look, I think all of us agree that we need to, make some reforms in different police departments around the country where you are seeing problems. But the fact of the matter remains that these police officers, vast majority of them, are putting their lives on the line every single day. And they need to know that the people in office have their back. I mean, police turnover right now is at some of its highest rates in American history. And that's because a lot of the police don't feel like they're respected. They don't feel like anyone's looking out for them. And they put a lot on the line. We ask a lot of folks in uniform, whether it be in the military or in law enforcement, every single day. And they're not getting the respect. They're not getting the health care they need. They're not getting a lot of the things that society needs to provide them, which first and foremost is making sure that we have their back.
Well, you look at the Minneapolis mayor, he was booed outside of his home for not defunding the police. So it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't. But, moving on, this bill that you mentioned, I believe it was $3 trillion that...
Yeah, $3 trillion. It's remarkable, right?
Yeah, so what was in that bill? What was it jam-packed with that Congressman Pappas decided was a good idea to vote yes on?
Yeah, well, let's start off the fact that they allowed for proxy voting around that time. Mm-hmm. And so, you have members of Congress now that have abdicated their responsibility to even show up and vote I mean, like, literally, it's the only thing they're being paid to do, right?
Yep.
These members of Congress are literally receiving a paycheck, a pretty nice sized one, by the way, to show up and vote on behalf of their constituents. And now they're even mailing that in, let alone what they actually voted for. So you look at that bill and you break it apart. It's $3 trillion. You had money going out the wazoo. I mean, look, I see it this way. COVID-19 impacted America, impacted the world. It's a time that should be able to bring us all together. And Pelosi, Pappas, and that Congress has done nothing but try to divide us. And so they jammed it through with a bunch of left-wing wish list items, including funding for early release of violent prisoners, like we talked about, stimulus checks for illegal immigrants instead of money that could have gone towards small businesses and working families who've been affected by COVID-19. Looked at money for National Endowment of Humanities, a whole host of left-wing programs, again, to the tune of $3 trillion. And so I just don't think that's representative of what we need at this time. You know, we should be focusing on how do we get our economy back on track? How do we bring small businesses back? How do we actually make sure that small businesses have allies down in Washington, D.C. who are trying to work with them through this, economic challenge that they're in right now? Instead, what you've got is this left-wing partisan Congress led by Nancy Pelosi and supported by people like Chris Pappas who are voting for none of that.
Well, let's talk about, jobs in the market. The U.S. futures market this morning is up 900 points. The S&P is up 5 points. So, the president's going to be running on renewing, restoring, rebuilding. He's going to be talking about the great American comeback. When you make it to Congress, what do you see as the great American Congress? What are you running on? What can you tell people that you want to do for your constituents?
Yeah, look, Mike, we have to make sure, first and foremost, that our next Congress, as well as the president's second term, is laser focused on the economy and bringing it back. We've done it once. I am confident we can do it again. And what we're going to have to do is, make sure that we're there for businesses that are disproportionately affected by government shutdowns because of COVID-19. So restaurants and hospitality come to mind. But then also making sure that we get back to incentivizing businesses to grow and prosper. And I think we have a really remarkable moment here. I think Americans are ready to actually bring a lot of manufacturing back from China and bring it onshore here in America. And so I think we need a real Made in America economic program, which is going to encourage manufacturing here in the United States. It'll be good for American workers, but just as importantly, it'll be good for American national security, because a lot of that will be pharmaceutical ingredients and high-tech national defense equipment and things like that, which we should be building here in America. So I'm really excited about that. I think it's a real opportunity for us as Americans. I know New Hampshire is going to try to be on the forefront of getting some of those businesses to bring their manufacturing from other countries back to American shores.
Well, we have Governor Allen coming up on the show in the next half hour, and he's actually going to be discussing exactly what you mentioned. So the Trump administration, led by Peter Navarro in particular, awarded a BARDA contract to Flow Pharmaceuticals. It was about 2 weeks ago for, I think, $354 million. And that was actually to produce generic drugs and their components here in the United States, something that was largely done and domiciled in India and China before that. So what you're mentioning is something that I think the administration is taking a very proactive stance on, but it's not something that the Congress has taken a very proactive stance. So here in the last couple of minutes, why don't you exactly explain what made you get into this race and what you've seen out of Congressman Pappas specifically that makes him so bad, right? You mentioned 95% or 90% he votes with AOC, 100% with Pelosi. What has he taken a stand on? Has he led on anything?
Yeah, well, Mike, I decided to get in because I really became frustrated by what I saw as a year of this Pelosi Congress. It really wasn't until January when all of a sudden I just said enough is enough. I mean, Chris Pappas, by the way, is the first Democrat in the country from a Trump district, because our district voted for President Trump in 2016. He's the first Democrat from a Trump district to support the impeachment process. The first one. He came out in favor of the impeachment process last July. So what that told me was that this guy is so partisan and so opposed to our president and so opposed to trying to make any sort of progress for our country that he's willing to support impeachment at any place, at any time, for any purpose. And then you see what he's continued to do when he marches lockstep with Nancy Pelosi every step of the way. I mean, this guy is just a partisan Pelosi puppet. That is all Chris Pappas is. And so I think we need to replace him. I think we need to send a member of Congress to Washington, D.C., who's going to represent New Hampshire and not Nancy Pelosi. And so that's the commitment I've made to Granite State voters, and it's the one that we're seeing a lot of receptivity to. I mean, whether it was through Zoom sessions and virtually the past few months, or now as we're beginning to get back to in-person meetings and events, people are ready for a change. They're ready for Congress to do things, and they're ready for Congress that's going to put America first, not just Nancy Pelosi's left-wing wish list first.
So, you mentioned it's been a lot of Zoom. Obviously, we've all been suffering through the coronavirus pandemic. But what are you seeing in your phone calls? What are you seeing? What are the constituents saying? Obviously, you can't do doors quite yet, but what has been the receptivity to your message? What have you noticed? When is your primary? And then finally, how can people donate? How can people get you into Congress and vote out, as I called him earlier, Pelosi shill?
Well, yeah, if people want to get involved in getting Chris Pappas, who's Nancy Pelosi's #1 proxy vote, out of Congress, they can go to, again, mattmowers.com. It's www.matt, Mowers, MOWERS.com. And I've got to tell you, we've had a lot of folks throughout the district. Every time we go to a new diner, or every time I get off the phone with another constituent, they're jumping online to get involved in the campaign, because what they're telling me is that they're ready for someone who's going to show that independence, show that conservative leadership that's been so desperately lacking out of Congress the past year. And they're ready for people who are actually going to go down there and actually try to get something done by working with the president to build the wall. Because I've got to tell you, we've got a drug addiction problem in our state. There's an influx of illegal drugs coming into our state that largely comes, and I learned this in my experience at the State Department working under President Trump. There's an influx of illegal drugs coming from Mexico and South America, as well as through the mail in China. So we need people who are going to work with the president to stop the influx of illegal drugs and actually build the wall. We're actually going to work with him to lower prescription drug prices. We're going to work with the president to hold China accountable and bring manufacturing back to America. And so those are the types of issues I'm hearing about when I talk to constituents and voters, and it's the type of thing I'm going to deliver on when I get to Congress.
Well, Matt, I just donated $20 to your campaign, and here's what I'm going to challenge our listeners to do. If you tweet at me at Mike Rubino 1991, I will match your donation of $20 until, I cannot give any more. So if you want to, donate to Matt Mowers, mattmowers.com, and then tweet at me at Mike Rubino 1991. I will match your donation to Matt Mowers. So I just gave $20. I encourage everybody to give $20. It's time to step up and vote out people that vote lock, stock, and barrel for Nancy Pelosi, with Nancy Pelosi, because I think that we as Americans respect independent minds, and that's what Matt's offering to bring to the Congress. He also, as you just said, Matt, you're going to help the president advance the agenda that, suits the Granite State and suits the American people.
Yeah, well, Mike, I really appreciate that contribution and really appreciate anyone else who supports. And thanks for making that generous offer, by the way. I hope everyone takes you up on it, because it's going to take – this is a national election at the end of the day, Mike, because you're exactly right. This is an election about, do we want Nancy Pelosi? When President Trump's giving the State of the Union address next February, do we want Nancy Pelosi standing behind him tearing up another copy of the State of the Union? And if the answer is no – and if you're like me, or your listeners are like me, and you can't stomach the idea of Nancy Pelosi standing up there this time next year, we need to take back Congress, and that runs through districts like this in New Hampshire.
Well, one more segment for you, Matt, and that's, I want to just get to China really fast. So on China, obviously they're facing what is an economic downturn based on the virus that was of their doing. What do you make of it? Where would you stand as a congressman against China? And what do you make of what the administration's done thus far? We just mentioned Peter Navarro and Flow Pharmaceuticals. So what do you make of it?
Yeah, well, look, I've got to tell you. So I worked at the State Department for 2 years under President Trump. Traveled about 200,000 miles around the world, focused actually on a lot of global health issues. So we took on and fought another pandemic, which was our global HIV pandemic. And what I saw firsthand was China using bags of cash to buy influence around the world. Whether it was in sub-Saharan Africa, whether it was at the World Health Organization, where I was at on a regular basis for meetings and saw firsthand how they bought influence in that organization, and the president was right to cut off funding to the WHO. What I make of it now is we need to use this as an opportunity to understand that we have way too much reliance on China, whether it's their investment in our financial services, whether it's the manufacturing that occurs in China, and that this is a moment when we need to actually look inward, and we need to ensure that ensuring that our supply chain is not beholden to China, but is actually controlled by Americans and American companies made by American workers. And we cannot, let's not forget that China is not looking out for the interests of its own people, let alone the interests of other countries. I mean, this is a country which currently has 1 million religious minorities being held in camps in China. This is a country where you have Buddhist monks setting themselves on fire in protest because they don't have the right to practice their religious beliefs. This is a country that doesn't even allow the Catholic Church to choose its own bishops, not to mention the fact that they're backing a whole host of companies with public dollars, which are now participating in commercialized spying, essentially, such as what's happening with Huawei. So these are not good actors, and it's a time that we hold China accountable, not just for what they've done to contribute to the spread of COVID-19, which has now been well documented, but also because this is not a country that's looking out for our best interests. We're much better off ensuring that we have American-made materials, and that we then use that to work with our allies around the world to spread American ideas and American companies as well.
Well, you heard it here, folks. Heard it here first, folks. Matt Mowers, candidate for Congress in New Hampshire's 1st Congressional District. Matt, thank you so much for joining me today.
Mike, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it, and hope all is well.